The email didn't make a sound when it sent. Just a hollow digital click that vanished into the humming void of servers in some anonymous data center. Cut to close up on a blinking cursor on a computer screen, then pull back to reveal a tired man in a fluorescent-lit office. Rayland watched that cursor pulse for a full minute. 12 years of his life distilled into a single keystroke. He'd come in at 6:47 a.m. He'd left at 11:23 p.m. He'd done that for 3,218 consecutive weekdays, give or take. His son's voice crackled through his phone's speaker from the carpool line. That familiar, reedy cough that never quite went away, the one that made the pediatrician frown and say, "Let's keep an eye on this." The office lights were that particular shade of aggressive white that made your teeth ache. Rayland had always thought he'd imagined that sensation. He hadn't. Cut to Rayland's perspective, staring at blurry spreadsheets on a monitor. His screen had become a gray smear of meaningless numbers 3 hours ago. His brain had stopped processing them. His fingers had simply continued the muscle memory of typing. He hit send. The nausea hit instantly. The movies always got this part wrong. There was no triumphant exhale, no cinematic weight lifting off his shoulders. Just a cold, creeping dread that slithered down his spine and settled in his gut like a stone. The mortgage was due in 12 days. The medical bills on his kitchen counter had multiplied like rabbits, each one bearing a new, more alarming shade of red ink. He'd missed his son's school play 2 weeks ago, the one where Leo played a tree and wore a cardboard trunk for 3 hours, scanning the audience desperately for his father's face. MC1. The tree had looked right through him when Rayland finally showed up for the pickup. His phone buzzed with a calendar reminder he'd set months ago. Q3 midpoint review, 2 p.m., Building 4, conference room C. He silenced it without looking. He didn't have much to pack. A chipped ceramic mug from some long-forgotten employee appreciation day. A photo of Leo, missing his 2 front teeth, grinning like a tiny pirate. A stress ball shaped like a globe that had long since deflated. He dropped them into a cardboard box he'd found in the supply closet. The mug clanked against the ball, a hollow, pathetic sound. Cut to wide shot of the empty office floor, Rayland walking alone. Rayland? It was Tina from procurement, clutching a reusable water bottle like a security blanket. Her eyes darted to the box. Taking a half day? Rayland shook his head. I resigned. Tina's mouth opened, then closed. Her knuckles went white around the bottle. People didn't resign at Ventrix Solutions. They were transitioned. They were reorganized. The word quit hung in the air like something profane, a disruption to the delicate ecosystem of compliant productivity. But the quarterly review is tomorrow, she whispered, as if the review was a sacred ritual that couldn't proceed without its sacrificial lamb. Tell them I send my regards, Rayland said, and he meant it as a joke, but it came out sounding like a threat. The elevator ride was agonizingly slow. He watched the floor numbers tick downward, each one a small death of routine. In the parking garage, his 10-year-old sedan looked like a stray dog huddled among a row of pristine German imports. The engine coughed twice before catching. The belt squealed. SFX, tires on wet pavement traffic on the interstate, was a sluggish river of brake lights and exhaustion. Rain began to fall, fat drops that smeared the world into watercolors. Rayland didn't turn on the radio. He couldn't stand the cheerful voices, the manufactured optimism. He ran the numbers in his head. Savings, enough for 3 months, maybe 4 if he canceled the internet and started shopping exclusively at the discount grocery store on the wrong side of town. After that, they were in freefall. He'd have to sell the car. He'd have to move in with his mother-in-law, which wasn't a threat. It was a fate worse than unemployment. Cut to Rayland's apartment building, a tired brick structure that had given up decades ago. The apartment smelled like boiled cabbage and old dreams. Rayland leaned his shoulder against the warped doorframe to get it open. Dad! Leo was on the living room floor, surrounded by a small army of plastic dinosaurs arranged in what appeared to be a highly strategic battle formation. The television played cartoons at a low murmur, the volume just high enough to drown out the sound of loneliness. Raylan dropped his keys on the kitchen counter. They skittered across the laminate with a tinny clatter. He knelt down beside his son, ignoring the twinge in his knees that reminded him he wasn't 25 anymore. He wrapped his arms around Leo, breathing in the smell of generic strawberry shampoo and playground dust. "You're home early," Leo said, pulling back to study his father's face. His dark hair stuck up in the back like a startled bird's. "Yep, I'm going to be home a lot more now." Leo's eyebrows furrowed in that way that always made Raylan's heart clench. "Did you get in trouble?" "No, buddy, I quit." "Why?" Raylan picked up a rubber triceratops, its horn chewed flat from months of enthusiastic play. "Because I wanted to play dinosaurs with you." Cut to close-up of the plastic toy in Raylan's hand. Leo considered this with the gravity of a tiny philosopher. "Okay, you're the Herbsaurus. You have to run from the T-Rex." Raylan roared softly, but inside the panic was a living thing, coiling and uncoiling in his chest. He had no plan, no safety net, just a living room that smelled like cabbage and a 6-year-old who believed in him completely. MC2, he had no idea what he was going to tell Leo when the money ran out. 2 days later, the rain returned with a vengeance. It hammered against the single-pane windows, rattling them in their frames. A leak had developed in the kitchen, dripping into a metal bowl with a hypnotic, maddening rhythm. Raylan was standing at the stove, burning eggs, when the intercom buzzed. It was a harsh, grating sound, like a dying bird. Raylan froze. Nobody buzzed the apartment. The mailman had a key. The neighbors just pounded on the door if they needed something. "Hello?" He pressed the button on the beige plastic box. Cut to static crackle on the intercom speaker. A voice cut through the static, sharp, clear, utterly out of place. "Mr. Hayes, it's Alara Vance, buzz me up." The name didn't register for 3 full seconds. When it did, Raylan felt the air leave his lungs. Alara Vance, CEO of Ventrix Solutions, a woman who graced the covers of business magazines, whose face was known in boardrooms across the hemisphere. A billionaire who had built a logistics empire with the cold precision of a chess grandmaster. A woman Raylan had only ever seen from across the auditorium at all-hands meetings. MC3, she was standing on his broken concrete stoop. "I'm sorry, I don't think I know you heard me, Raylan. It's freezing out here. My driver is parked illegally. Floor 2, correct? Buzz me in." His finger moved on its own, pressing the unlock button. A loud clack echoed from the stairwell. Raylan stepped back from the intercom, suddenly hyper-aware of every flaw in his apartment. The Legos scattered like caltrops. The stained throw blanket draped over the couch. The unmistakable smell of burnt eggs. Cut to Raylan scrambling to hide evidence of a disorganized life. He kicked the Legos under the coffee table, tossed the scorched eggs into the trash, and threw a dish towel over the bowl, catching the roof leak. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, not the shuffle of his elderly neighbor, but the sharp, decisive click of expensive heels on cheap linoleum. Raylan opened the door just as she reached the landing. Alara Vance was exactly as imposing as her magazine profile suggested, but in person, the effect was almost suffocating. She was tall, wearing a tailored coat that probably cost more than his car. Her dark hair was pulled into a flawless knot. Raindrops clung to her shoulders, glittering like tiny diamonds under the flickering hallway light. Her eyes were a pale, piercing gray. They held no warmth, but they held an unsettling degree of focus. "Mr. Hayes," she said. Her voice was lower in person, rougher around the edges. "Ms. Vance." Raylan stood in the doorway, blocking her path. His brain simply refused to process the protocol for hosting a billionaire in his squalid apartment. She arched an eyebrow. "Are you going to make me stand in the hall? It smells like dead things out here." "Cabbage," Raylan corrected automatically. "It's cabbage." SFX, door creaking open, he stepped back, pulling the door wider. Alara stepped inside. The apartment seemed to shrink around her. She paused on the threadbare mat, looking down at her leather boots, then at his scuffed floorboards. "You can leave your shoes on," Rayland said. The latch clicked behind her. Generous, she murmured. She walked into the center of the living room, her eyes doing a rapid sweep of the space. They landed on the headless action figure on the TV stand, the stack of past due bills on the dining table, the mixing bowl catching the leak. Plink. Nice acoustics, she said, turning to face him. Rayland crossed his arms. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a raw, defensive anger. What are you doing here? He didn't offer her a seat. He didn't offer her coffee. Alara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. She held it out. Rayland didn't take it. He recognized the company letterhead. Your exit interview, she said, letting her hand drop. Or rather, the 6-page manifesto you attached to the standard HR resignation form. Rayland felt heat rise up his neck. When he'd quit, HR had sent an automated exit survey. Most people clicked better opportunity and moved on. Rayland, fueled by 12 years of repressed rage and 2 glasses of cheap whiskey, had written a detailed, brutal dissection of the company's flagship logistics algorithm. He'd mapped out with mathematical precision exactly how the algorithm's optimization protocols were creating cascading failures. Driver burnout, warehouse errors, phantom shrinkages that bled millions from the bottom line. MC4, he didn't think anyone would ever read it. You read it, Rayland stated. My assistant flags anything over 1,000 words, Alara said. She stepped over to the small dining table and set the papers down next to his medical bills. I read it at 2 a.m. I read it again at 6 a.m. She turned back to him, those pale gray eyes locked on his face. You wrote that the Prometheus protocol is, and I quote, a digital meat grinder designed by people who have never touched a shipping box, structurally guaranteed to fail the moment a human being needs to use the bathroom. Rayland shifted his weight. I was drinking when I wrote that. The phrasing lacks professionalism, Alara conceded. The phrasing is poetry, Rayland, but more importantly, the math is right. Rayland blinked. What? The math, she repeated, gesturing to the papers. You cross-referenced the shrink rates in the Midwest hubs with mandated overtime hours. You proved a direct correlation between the algorithm's forced routing and mechanical failure rates. You proved what I've suspected for 6 months, but my VP of engineering swore was just adaptation friction. So you came to my apartment to thank me for a bug report. Rayland asked, the cynicism dripping from every word. You could have sent an email or a gift card to Starbucks. Alara's expression didn't shift, but a muscle feathered in her jaw. She looked around the room again, the squalor, the damp. The obvious markers of a man standing on the edge of a cliff. I didn't come to thank you, she said. She pulled out one of the wobbly wooden chairs and sat down. The chair groaned under her weight. I came to find out why a man who understands the fundamental flaws of a billion-dollar infrastructure better than its architects was spending his life moving spreadsheets in a cubicle, and why he chose to quit instead of fixing it. Quote, the system failed you. It failed your son. But hiding in this damp apartment doesn't fix anything. Rayland stared at her. She looked ridiculous, a hawk perched on a chain-link fence. I was a mid-level logistics coordinator, Ms. Vance. I wasn't paid to fix the architecture. I was paid to run the reports. And clearly you stopped wanting to do that. I stopped being able to do it. Rayland ran a hand through his uncombed hair. The aggression in his voice was slipping, replaced by grinding exhaustion. I have a son. He's 6. I haven't seen him awake for more than an hour a day in 9 months. The algorithm you bought to save the company was demanding 60-hour weeks just to keep the baseline functional. Then it became 70, then 80. Alara watched him. Her gaze wasn't sympathetic, it was forensic. She was studying his posture, his tone, the dark hollows under his eyes. You think I don't know the human cost of scale? She asked quietly. I think, Rayland countered, pointing a finger at her, that you look at a dashboard, you see red numbers and green numbers. I see the people who have to sacrifice their marriages, their health, and their kids to turn the red numbers green. So don't sit in my kitchen and act like we're solving a puzzle together. You built a machine that eats people. I just decided I didn't want to be chewed up anymore. SFX, rain against glass, steady drip into metal bowl. The silence that followed was thick. The only sound was the rain lashing against the glass and that relentless plink, plink, plink into the bowl. Alara didn't flinch. She reached out and touched the edge of the table. The wood was deeply gouged in one corner where Leo had used a fork as a hammer. She ran her manicured thumb over the groove. When I took over Ventrix 3 years ago, Alara began, her voice devoid of its previous edge, the board gave me a mandate. Cut operational costs by 25% or they'd break the company into pieces and sell the scraps. Thousands of people would lose their jobs. She looked up, meeting his eyes. I authorized the Prometheus protocol because the projections showed a 20% efficiency gain. I didn't build a machine to eat people, Rayland. I built a lifeboat. But right now, the lifeboat is taking on water. And the engineers who built it are too busy protecting their egos to find the leak. And you expect me to care? I expect you to want to work, she said bluntly. You don't have a job. You have past due medical bills on your table. You live in a building that violates half a dozen municipal codes. And you have a child who, judging by the pediatric nebulizer I saw in the bathroom, requires expensive health care. Rayland felt a flash of pure, primal anger. He pushed off the counter, taking a step toward her. Don't you bring my son into this. You don't know anything about my life. Alara stood up. She was nearly as tall as he was, and she didn't back down. The air between them crackled with volatile energy. MC5, I know that pride doesn't pay for prescriptions, she fired back, her voice low and hard. I know that you're angry. You have every right to be. The system failed you. It failed your son. But shutting your door and hiding in this damp apartment doesn't fix anything. Rayland clenched his fists at his sides. The rough fabric of his sweatpants felt abrasive against his palms. What do you want, Alara? He used her first name, stripping away the corporate deference. She noticed. The corner of her mouth twitched. I want you to come back, she said. Not as a logistics coordinator. I'm firing the VP of engineering this afternoon. The entire department is a toxic echo chamber. I need someone who actually understands how the warehouse floor communicates with the routing nodes. I need someone who knows exactly why the system fails when a human being needs to take a break. Rayland let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. You want to put a mid-level manager in charge of a complete systemic overhaul. The board will crucify you. Let me worry about the board, she said. I'm offering you a position as Director of Systems Integration. You report directly to me, nobody else. You rewrite the routing parameters. You implement hard caps on driver hours. You restructure the hub communications. You have the authority to burn it all down and build it back properly. Rayland stared at her. His mind was spinning. You're insane. Probably, Alara admitted. A dry, humorless smile touched her lips. But I'm also desperate. If Prometheus fails, Ventrix fails. And your 6-page drunken manifesto is the only blueprint I've seen that actually identifies the disease instead of just treating the symptoms. Before Rayland could respond, the front door rattled. The handle turned. Mrs. Albright, the elderly woman from downstairs, stood in the doorway, clutching a dripping umbrella. Beside her stood Leo, wearing a bright yellow raincoat and holding a soggy piece of construction paper. Cut to Leo standing in the doorway, water dripping from his raincoat. Rayland, dear, Mrs. Albright wheezed, shaking her umbrella onto the hallway floor. They let them out early. Power went out at the school. Leo stepped inside. His boots left wet, muddy tracks on the linoleum. He looked at Rayland, then his eyes slid to the tall, imposing stranger standing in the middle of the living room. Alara Vance, billionaire CEO, ruthless board negotiator, turned slowly to look at the 6-year-old boy. The tension in the room shifted from professional combat to jarring domestic reality. Alara looked at Leo with the rigid, cautious posture of someone confronting an unexploded ordnance. She clearly had no idea what to do with a child. Leo blinked his large, dark eyes. He wiped a raindrop off his nose with the back of his hand. "Are you the landlord?" he asked. His voice was slightly raspy. Because my dad says the landlord is a parasite, but you don't look like a bug. Quote, are you the landlord? Because my dad says the landlord is a parasite, but you don't look like a bug. Rayland closed his eyes. He actually prayed for the floor to open up and swallow him. A heavy silence descended. Rayland opened his eyes, waiting for the billionaire to turn on her heel and walk out, offended and done with this chaotic circus. Instead, Alara looked down at her expensive leather boots, then back at the boy. No, she said, her gravelly voice surprisingly gentle, though completely devoid of typical adult-to-child baby talk. I'm not a parasite, I'm your father's boss. Oh, Leo said. He frowned, looking down at his muddy boots. He doesn't like you. Mrs. Albright gasped. Rayland rubbed his temples, feeling a headache blooming behind his eyes. Leo, go to your room and take off your wet boots, please. It's all right, Alara said. She took a step toward Leo. She didn't crouch down. She clearly didn't know how to bridge that physical gap, but she leaned forward slightly. Why doesn't he like me? Leo looked at Rayland, seeking permission. Rayland just gave a defeated sigh and nodded. MC6, because, Leo explained, holding up the soggy construction paper, you make him stare at a glowing box all night and he gets sad, and then we can't play dinosaurs. The absolute unvarnished truth hung in the air, smelling faintly of wet cardboard and rain. Alara absorbed the words. She didn't look away from the boy. For a fleeting second, the cold, impenetrable mask of the CEO fractured. Rayland saw something raw flash in her pale gray eyes, a profound, staggering guilt. It was there, and then it was suppressed, pushed down beneath years of corporate conditioning. She slowly straightened up, turning her gaze back to Rayland. The defensive hostility that had armored him a moment ago felt suddenly useless. They were just two tired people standing in a leaky room, confronted by the collateral damage of a broken machine. He's right, Alara said softly. The words were meant for Rayland, not the child. I did do that. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a sleek silver pen, and uncapped it. She walked over to the cheap dining table, picked up a blank piece of paper from the back of an unpaid electric bill, and wrote down a number. She set the pen down next to it. I'm not asking you to forgive the company, Rayland, she said, her voice regaining a fraction of its steel but tempered with a new quiet desperation. I'm asking you to help me fix it, so it doesn't happen to anyone else. She walked toward the door, pausing as she passed Leo. She looked down at him. Nice raincoat, she said stiffly. Thanks, Leo mumbled. Alara opened the door. The smell of cabbage and wet hallway rushed back in. She looked over her shoulder at Rayland. My direct line is on that paper. Call me by 5 p.m. She stepped out, pulling the door shut behind her. The latch clicked. Rayland stood frozen for a long moment. The rain hammered against the glass. The drip in the kitchen continued its steady rhythm. He walked over to the table and looked at the paper. Next to a 10-digit phone number, she had written a salary. Rayland stared at the zeros. It was enough to move them out of this building. It was enough to buy the prescriptions out of pocket 100 times over. It was enough to buy back his life. MC7, but more than the money, it was the power to rip the algorithm apart with his bare hands. Dad, Leo tugged on his sweatpants. Is she going to fire you again? Rayland picked up the piece of paper. It felt heavy, loaded with the weight of impending change. He looked down at his son, noticing the slight wheeze in his breathing from the damp air. No, Rayland said. A strange, fierce spark ignited in his chest. I think she just handed me a sledgehammer. The 48th floor smelled of lemon polish and aggressively cold, recycled air. It was a sterile, oxygen-thinned environment designed to keep people awake and anxious. Rayland's new access badge hung from a woven lanyard around his neck. It was a heavy piece of encrypted plastic that felt like a dog tag. He pressed it against the security scanner outside the executive boardroom. The light blinked green, and the heavy glass door slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss. 13 engineers sat around a sprawling mahogany table. They wore fitted slacks and quarter-zip sweaters. Their laptops projected an aura of defensive hostility. At the head of the table sat Alara Vance. She wore a tailored navy blazer, her hands steepled in front of her. Cut to the boardroom engineers looking uncomfortable. "You're late, Mr. Hayes," she said. Her voice was flat, betraying nothing. "Traffic," Rayland replied. He walked to the front of the room. He didn't apologize. He dropped his battered leather briefcase onto the polished wood. The dull thud made a junior developer flinch. Rayland uncapped a red dry erase marker. The sharp chemical smell of the ink instantly brought him back to his old cubicle, to the countless late nights trying to make the impossible math work. He turned to the massive glass whiteboard that spanned the length of the wall. "Your routing logic is garbage," Rayland said to the room, not bothering with an introduction. He didn't have the patience for corporate foreplay. "You built a 7-minute staging buffer for the Chicago hub, a 7-minute buffer for a loading dock that takes 14 minutes to clear on a dry day." A senior architect, a man named Morrison, leaned forward, his face flushed with indignation. "The algorithm dynamically adjusts based on historical load times. The friction is localized user error on the floor." Rayland turned. He locked eyes with Morrison. "Have you ever driven a forklift?" Silence hung in the boardroom. The hum of the HVAC unit suddenly sounded deafening. "Have you ever tried to maneuver 3 tons of palletized electronics across a concrete floor slick with spilled hydraulic fluid while a scanner on your wrist vibrates every 8 seconds telling you you're behind schedule?" Rayland didn't raise his voice, but the tremor of pure, distilled anger in his chest bled into the syllables. "It's not localized friction. It's physiological reality. When humans panic, they drop things. When they drop things, the line stops. Your dynamic adjustment doesn't account for human adrenaline or exhaustion. It just punishes the driver." Rayland turned back to the board. He started writing out the equations. He didn't use presentation slides. He used raw, brutal numbers. He mapped out the cascading failure points, the phantom shrinkage caused by rush scanning, the maintenance costs of pushing the transport fleet past redline limits. He sweated through the underarms of his cheap dress shirt. His handwriting was jagged, erratic, entirely imperfect, but the math was undeniable. MC8, for 45 minutes, he dismantled their billion-dollar architecture piece by piece. He stripped away the buzzwords, the synergy, the agile optimization. He exposed the bleeding, exhausted arteries of the company. When he finally dropped the marker onto the aluminum tray, the clatter echoed sharply. He was breathing heavily. His hands were shaking. He looked at Alara. She hadn't moved. Her pale gray eyes were tracking the red ink on the glass. Then slowly she shifted her gaze to Morrison. "Can you refute this?" she asked. The gravel in her voice was absolute zero. Morrison opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at the board, his jaw tight. It would require a fundamental rewrite of the localized staging protocols. We'd have to inject hard limits on driver utilization. That drops our efficiency metric by 9%. Which stops the mechanical breakdowns and warehouse turnover that are currently costing us 17%. Rayland snapped back, wiping a smear of red ink off his thumb. Alara stood up. The scraping of her chair was loud in the tense quiet. She walked slowly over to the whiteboard, standing shoulder to shoulder with Rayland. She smelled faintly of expensive jasmine and black tea. "Rewrite it," Alara ordered, looking out at the room of engineers. "Ms. Vance, the board," Morrison started. "I will handle the board," she cut him off, her tone leaving no room for oxygen. "You have 3 weeks to integrate Mr. Hayes's parameters. If the system demands a human being skip a meal to hit a metric, you scrap the code and start over. Am I clear?" Reluctant, fractured murmurs of assent rippled around the table. "Meeting adjourned," she said. The engineers packed their laptops with quiet, frantic energy, filing out of the room until only Rayland and Alara remained. Rayland leaned against the edge of the mahogany table, suddenly bone-tired. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving him hollow. Alara picked up the red marker Rayland had dropped. She turned it over in her manicured fingers. "You sweated through your shirt," she noted dryly, not looking at him. "I'm not a public speaker," Rayland muttered, rubbing his temple. You were brutal, she corrected. She capped the marker with a sharp snap. It was exactly what they needed. She looked at him, and for the second time since they met, the armor cracked. A genuine, tired smile touched the corner of her mouth. Get some sleep, Rayland. The sledgehammer part is over. Tomorrow we have to rebuild the walls. Cut to time-lapse of office windows, months passing. 3 months later, the suffocating heat of August baked the asphalt outside. But the 48th floor remained hermetically sealed in a 68-degree chill. Rayland sat in his new office. The leather of his chair squeaked, a rich, heavy sound that still made him internally wince. He stared at his monitors. The bleeding red columns that had dictated his blood pressure for a decade were gone, replaced by a dull, steady amber. The Prometheus patch was live. It wasn't a miracle. It was just a tourniquet, but the hemorrhaging had finally stopped. Cut to Elara entering Rayland's office, holding 2 glasses. The heavy glass door clicked open. Elara leaned against the jamb. She had traded her severe, structured blazer for a loose, black sweater that looked expensive and impossibly soft. In her hands, she held 2 heavy crystal tumblers. The ice clinked a sharp, glassy chime in the quiet room. She walked in and set a glass next to his keyboard. The condensation immediately began to pool on the dark mahogany desk. You're violating your own mandatory downtime parameters, she noted. Her gravelly voice carried the ragged edge of a 70-hour week. Rayland picked up the glass. The bourbon smelled of charred oak and damp earth. Denver Hub is lagging by 4 minutes. Denver is breathing, she corrected. She walked around his desk and leaned against the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the smog-hazed skyline. The cynical, combative armor she usually wore was stripped down, leaving only a bone-deep exhaustion they both now shared. The board saw the shrink reports today. You bought us a quarter, maybe 2. I bought the drivers time to eat lunch, Rayland muttered, taking a sip. The liquid burned a clean, hot path down his throat. His phone suddenly buzzed against the desk, vibrating loudly against the wood. A FaceTime request. He tapped the screen. Leo's face filled the frame, his cheeks smeared with something that looked suspiciously like chocolate. But more importantly, the persistent rattling wheeze that used to score his breathing was entirely absent. MC9, Dad, Leo demanded loudly. Mrs. Albright says I have to go to bed, but we didn't finish the Lego rover. Elara stepped behind Rayland's chair. She stared at the screen, an unreadable tension tightening her jaw. She still didn't know how to exist in this domestic sphere. Hello, Leo, Elara said stiffly. Leo narrowed his eyes at the camera lens. Are you the boss lady? I am. Did you make my dad do the glowing box thing again? Elara let out a dry, rusty exhale that might have been a laugh. No. I'm actually kicking him out of the building right now. Leo considered this. Okay, tell him to drive fast, bye. The screen abruptly went black. Rayland set the phone down. The silence settled back into the room, thick and complicated. He looked at the empty black screen, then back up at Elara. She was staring at his desk, her pale eyes locked on a crude crayon drawing of a green dinosaur taped to the edge of his monitor. Go home, Rayland, she murmured. He drained the rest of the bourbon, the ice hitting his teeth, and stood up. He grabbed his worn jacket. The heavy corporate security badge slapped against his chest as he moved. It no longer felt like a collar. MC-10? As he walked toward the elevator, leaving the billionaire alone in the quiet, humming tower, he realized the machine was still a machine, vast and inherently hungry. But for the first time in his life, his hand was resting firmly on the kill switch. If this story of fighting back against the corporate machine resonated with you, don't let it stop here. We all know what it feels like to be just another number on a spreadsheet. But Rayland proved that human grit can rewrite the algorithm. Hit that like button if you believe in prioritizing people over profits. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their worth, and subscribe to my channel for more raw, grounded stories of everyday defiance.